The first time I heard about Shimizu Hospital was from an old man in a ramen shop, deep in the outskirts of Nagano Prefecture. I was chasing urban legends for a feature article, one of those ghost touring pieces that magazines love to publish around Halloween. My editor was expecting the usual fluff: creepy photographs, tales of disembodied whispers, local folklore. But when the man spoke of the hospital, his voice dropped into something heavier than a casual ghost story. "They didn't just die there," he said. "They stayed." I asked what he meant, and he just shook his head. "No one goes there now, not even kids. There's something wrong. You should leave it alone." Naturally, I didn't. By the time I made my way to the hospital the next morning, a cold drizzle had set in. The building sat at the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by mist that curled like living tendrils around the treetops. It looked more like a mausoleum than a hospital. Its pale concrete walls were stained black in streaks, and every window was shattered or boarded up. I had read about Shimizu before. It had been a psychiatric facility in the 1950s, a cutting-edge institute that attracted patients from across the country. But then, something went wrong. Staff started vanishing. Patients died in gruesome, unexplained ways. The hospital shut down in 1962, and no one dared to reopen it. Some claimed a cult had moved in afterward, using the empty wards and operating theaters for rituals. Others said the cult had been there before the hospital, and that the patients had unknowingly been part of their work. Standing at the threshold now, rain dripping from my hair, I didn't feel the usual thrill of curiosity. There was a weight in the air here, a kind of suffocating stillness. But I forced myself to step inside. The first thing that hit me was the smell: damp concrete and mildew, but with something sharper underneath, like the faint tang of iron. The entrance was a hollow shell, its tilted floor cracked and coated with debris. Old medical equipment, rusted gurneys, overturned wheelchairs lay scattered like the aftermath of a war. I clicked on my flashlight and started recording audio notes on my phone. Shimizu Hospital, January 14th. Condition is as expected for a site abandoned 60 years ago. No signs of recent activity. My voice echoed faintly, but the sound felt swallowed by the darkness, like the building didn't want it. The deeper I went, the stranger it became. At first, it was just small things: scratched markings on the walls, faded graffiti in language I didn't recognize. One hallway was lined with mirrors, though most of the glass was broken. A faint coppery smell seemed to linger here, growing stronger with every step. I stopped when I saw the first symbol. It was carved into a wall at the end of the hallway, a jagged circle filled with geometric patterns that made my head ache to look at. I crouched down to snap a photo, but as the flash went off, I thought I saw something move in the broken mirror behind me. A pale blur, there and gone in an instant. I froze, my heart pounding, and I swept my flashlight across the glass. Nothing. Just my reflection, distorted in the shattered shards. "Get it together," I muttered, shaking off the unease. But as I turned to leave the hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection lingered just a fraction of a second longer than it should have. I pressed on, trying to ignore the chill creeping into my spine. The hospital's layout was a maze of identical corridors and peeling doors. I checked each room as I passed, most of them empty except for rusted bed frames or collapsed furniture. Then I found the chapel. The air inside was heavier than anywhere else. The floor was covered in dust, but a path had been cleared straight down the center, leading to a makeshift altar at the front. Candles, dozens of them, were arranged in a semicircle around a low stone slab. They'd long since burned out, but the melted wax formed a pattern that matched the symbol I'd seen earlier. Behind the altar, something hung on the wall. It looked like a piece of art at first, a mess of black and red strokes on tattered canvas. But as I moved closer, the lines resolved into something unmistakable. A figure, painted in blood. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its face jagged void, and it seemed to be reaching outward, its fingers stretching toward the altar. My chest tightened. I'd spent years chasing urban legends, and I'd seen many share of hoaxes. This felt different. This felt old. Real. I took a step closer to the altar, holding my breath. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper just behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It wasn't a word exactly, more like a sound shaped into meaning. It scraped against the inside of my skull, leaving behind a single, unshakable idea. Stay. I bolted from the chapel, heart pounding, and stumbled into a new hallway that I didn't recognize. The air here was colder, and the walls seemed closer together, as if the building itself were pressing inward. My flashlight flickered, then went out completely. In the sudden darkness, I felt the whisper again. Not in my ears, but in my head. It was stronger now. Sharper. Stay. I fumbled for my phone, using its weak screen light to guide me. Every door I passed was locked, the handles cold and unyielding under my grip. My pulse was racing, and every instinct screamed to get out, but I couldn't find the way back. Then, at the end of the hallway, I saw it. A figure standing perfectly still, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. It didn't move, but I could feel its gaze, cold and empty, boring into me. I took a step back, and the whisper shifted into a single piercing command. You shouldn't have come. I don't know how I made it back to the main hallway. My hands were shaking, and my breathing was ragged, but eventually, the narrow corridor spat me out into the open expanse of the lobby. I leaned against a cracked pillar, trying to steady myself, my mind spinning. The figure, the whisper. It wasn't just a story. Something was here, and it knew I was here too. I told myself I should leave, pack up, get back to Tokyo, spin this into some half-baked story about eerie vibes and strange graffiti. But as my breathing slowed and my rational mind took back over, I felt that nagging pull. The same one that had brought me to Japan in the first place. I wasn't imagining this. There was something real here. And if I was the one to uncover it, it would be the story of my career. This story is brought to you by Audible, where you can get a free audiobook and a 30-day free trial today by using the link in the description. Love the chilling tales you hear on this show? Take them anywhere with Audible's huge library of horror audiobooks. Don't miss out. Click the link in the description, claim your free book, and let the terrifying tales follow you wherever you go. Now back to the story. The rain outside had grown heavier, hammering against the broken windows like a warning. I turned on my flashlight again and checked my camera. Still functional. The photo I'd taken in the hallway showed the symbol clearly, though I swear the lines seemed deeper now, more jagged. I glanced at my phone. No service. Typical. I had considered leaving then, but something caught my eye near the far side of the lobby. A door I hadn't noticed before. It was partially open, a sliver of blackness visible between its warped frame and the wall. I hesitated, but curiosity won out. The door led to a stairwell, its steps descending into the basement. The smell was worse here. Damp concrete mixed with something metallic and sour, like rotting meat. The further I went, the darker it became. The walls were covered in peeling paint and smudged handprints, and I could hear faint noises below. A soft tapping, like fingernails on stone. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a long, low corridor with the heavy steel doors. Each one had a small grated window at eye level, and though the glass was filthy, I could just make out shapes beyond them. Beds, restraints, chains. This was the ward where they had kept the special patients. I moved cautiously, sweeping my flashlight from door to door. Most of the rooms were empty, but one had a small table with a stack of yellowed papers. They were medical records, though the details were sparse. Dates of admission, patient numbers, and a single cryptic note scrawled in red ink on several pages. Transfer to Ward X. I flipped through the pages, but there was no explanation of what Ward X meant. Then I noticed the symbols. At the bottom of every page, faint but deliberate, was the same jagged circle I'd seen carved into the wall upstairs. That's when the tapping started again. It came from further down the corridor, louder this time, like someone or something was tapping a rhythm on the metal walls. I froze, straining my ears. The sound was irregular, almost playful, like it wanted me to follow. Against my better judgment, I did. The corridor ended in a wide double door, the kind you'd expect to see in an operating theater. Unlike the others, this door was pristine, untouched by time or decay. My flashlight beam reflected off its surface, and as I stepped closer, I noticed a faint outline of handprints smeared across it. Too many to count. I pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, much larger than I had expected. The ceiling was lined with dangling chains, some of which swayed gently despite the absence of any breeze. The walls were covered in the same geometric symbols, but here they seemed to pulse faintly, as though they were alive. In the center of the room stood a massive stone slab, surrounded by a ring of blackened candles. On the slab was a book. I hesitated, but the same pull that had kept me in the hospital urged me forward. The book was bound in something dark and cracked, its pages thick and uneven. The writing inside was a mix of Japanese characters and something else, symbols I couldn't decipher, their shapes crawling across the page like living things. The air grew heavier as I flipped through the pages, each one filled with strange diagrams and instructions, rituals, sacrifices, names. Then I saw the final page. It wasn't written in ink. The letters were jagged and uneven. Carved into the paper was something sharp, and the words chilled me to the core. Their work is never done. Neither is yours. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing from the hallway I'd just come from. I froze, clutching the book, my pulse racing. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the door. I turned off my flashlight, plunging the room into darkness, and crouched behind the slab, barely daring to breathe. The door creaked open. Something entered. I couldn't see it, but I could feel its presence, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on my lungs. It moved slowly, the sound of its steps uneven, like it was dragging something behind it. A faint whisper filled the air, low and guttural, the same voice I'd heard before. Stay. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it wouldn't notice me. But then, the whisper changed. It grew sharper, louder, filled with malice. You've taken it. You're part of it now. I didn't want to find out what that meant. I bolted, clutching the book to my chest, and ran blindly through the corridors. The whisper followed me, growing louder, overlapping itself until it became a deafening roar. The hospital seemed to shift around me, its walls closing in, its hallways looping back on themselves. Everywhere I turned, I saw fleeting glimpses of movement. Figures darting just out of sight, shadows bleeding across the walls. This building was alive, and it wanted me to stay. At last, I saw the faint outline of the entrance, the pale gray light of the storm outside. I sprinted toward it, the roar in my ears reaching a crescendo. Just as I crossed the threshold, something cold and sharp grazed the back of my neck, and I stumbled onto the wet grass outside. The whisper stopped. The hospital fell silent. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, soaked to the bone and gasping for air. I threw the book into the passenger seat and sped off, the hospital shrinking in my rearview mirror. I thought I was safe, but as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still with me. And then, in the mirror, I saw it, a pale face staring back at me from the back seat. I don't remember driving back to the inn. My hands were trembling the entire time, and I had to keep glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one or nothing was in the back seat. The road felt impossibly long, stretching out under the weight of the storm clouds pressing down on the world. When I finally reached the parking lot, the engine sputtered and died before I could even turn the key. I sat there for a moment, rain hammering against the windshield, my head resting against the steering wheel as I tried to process what had just happened. The book sat on the passenger seat. I couldn't bring myself to touch it, but I couldn't leave it either. The room at the inn was small and cheap, with thought to be mats that smelled faintly of mildew. I dropped my camera bag onto the floor and locked the door behind me, sliding the deadbolt into place. Then, for good measure, I dragged the lower dresser in front of it. I don't know what I thought I was protecting myself from. The book sat on the table. It didn't feel right leaving it in the car, and now that I was here, I couldn't stop looking at it. It seemed wrong somehow, like it didn't belong in this world. The words from the page echoed in my head. Their work is never done. Neither is yours. I should have burned it, thrown it into the river and never looked back. But I was a journalist, and curiosity had always been my worst enemy. So, I opened it. The diagrams seemed to shift under the flickering light of the room. Some of the writing I couldn't understand, but I recognized enough to piece together the basics. The cult that had taken over Shimizu Hospital hadn't just been performing rituals. They were trying to bind something to the hospital, something ancient, something that existed between life and death. The book didn't name it directly, but it referred to it as the Watcher. The cult believed it was a guardian, a being that could grant them power and immortality, but only if they followed its rules. The rituals involved sacrifices, patients, staff, even members of the cult itself. But it wasn't just their bodies the Watcher demanded. It wanted their presence, their souls. I slammed the book shut, bile rising in my throat. But it was too late. The room was dead silent. The sound of rain outside had faded, replaced by a thick, oppressive silence. The kind that makes your ears ring. And then I heard it. A faint tapping at the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the silhouette of something on the other side. Tall, with long, angular limbs that didn't move quite right. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The tapping came again, sharper this time, like nails scraping against the glass. Then a voice followed. Low and guttural, it whispered the same word I'd heard in the hospital. Stay. I backed away from the window, my hands trembling. My phone was on the table, but when I picked it up, the screen was black. It was dead. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, as if whatever was outside was trying to claw its way in. And then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the window, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When I finally worked up the courage to pull the curtains aside, the window was empty, just darkness and rain. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the futon with my back against the wall, the book open in my lap, trying to make sense of it all. There was a section near the end that I hadn't noticed before. Notes scribbled hastily in the margins, as if whoever had written this was in a panic. The binding isn't perfect. It escapes the rules. It follows. I read the words over and over, dread sinking into my stomach. The Watcher wasn't bound to the hospital, not completely, and by taking the book, I brought it with me. At dawn, I packed my things and left the inn. The book stayed in my bag, though I hated the weight of it. It felt alive somehow, like it was watching me. The drive back to Tokyo was a blur. The highway stretched on forever, the horizon swallowed by gray skies. Every so often, I'd glance in the rearview mirror and catch something in the corner of my eye, a pale face staring at me from the shadows. By the time I reached my apartment, I was running on fumes. I locked the door behind me, pulled the curtain shut, and collapsed onto the couch, trying to convince myself that it was over. But deep down, I knew that it wasn't. That night, I dreamed of the hospital. I was back in the chapel, standing before the altar. The figure painted on the wall was gone, but I could feel it behind me, breathing down my neck. The whisper was everywhere now, louder than ever, overlapping voices all saying the same thing. Stay, stay, stay. When I turned around, I saw them, the cult, dozens of them, their faces obscured by shadow, their bodies draped in tattered robes. They stood in a perfect circle around the altar, unmoving, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. And at the center of the circle was me. I woke up drenched in sweat, my chest heaving. The room was dark, and for a moment, I couldn't tell if I was still dreaming. Then, I heard the whisper. It wasn't coming from the window this time. It was inside the apartment. I turned on every light in the place, my heart pounding. The whispers were everywhere, overlapping and echoing, growing louder and louder until it became a single deafening roar. I stumbled back into the living room, and that's when I saw it. The book was open on the coffee table, its pages flipping on their own, faster and faster, as if an invisible hand was tearing through them. The air around it shimmered, the symbols glowing faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. And then, it stopped. The room fell silent. The final page of the book was blank, except for a single sentence scrawled in fresh wet ink. Return to where it began. The drive back to Shimizu Hospital felt like walking into my own grave. I didn't want to go. Every nerve in my body screamed to throw that book in a fire and then just disappear, to quit journalism entirely and spend the rest of my life pretending this never happened. But the whisper had taken over. It wasn't just something I heard now. It was inside me, pushing, twisting, demanding. Return to where it began. By the time I reached the hospital, the sun was sinking below the mountains, casting the forest into deep bruised shadows. The building loomed ahead, its hollow windows staring down at me like the sockets of a skull. This time, I didn't hesitate. I grabbed the book, slung my camera bag over my shoulder, and stepped inside. The air inside was colder than I remembered, and the smell, iron and mildew, was overwhelming. It felt like the building had been waiting for me. My flashlight flickered as I moved deeper into the hospital, the beam weak and sputtering. The halls looked different now, warped somehow. The graffiti was gone, replaced by endless lines of symbols carved into the walls, their jagged edges glowing faintly in the darkness. The whispers returned almost immediately, louder now, overlapping voices that spoke directly into my skull. It's time. Complete the work. The book seemed to pull me, leading me through a maze of corridors. I passed the chapel, its altar still coated in blackened wax, but the book didn't stop there. The book seemed to pull me, leading me through a maze of corridors. I passed the chapel, its altar still coated in blackened wax, but the book didn't stop there. It guided me to a staircase I hadn't seen before, the one that spiraled downward into the earth. My feet moved on their own, carrying me into the suffocating darkness. At the bottom of the stairs was a door. It was massive and ancient, made of wood so dark it was almost black. The symbols on it glowed brighter than ever, writhing like living things. The whispers reached a crescendo, screaming inside my head. "Enter! Complete the work!" My hand shook as I pushed the door open. The room was beyond enormous, far larger than should have been possible beneath the hospital. The ceiling disappeared into shadow, and the walls were lined with jagged black stone, carved into the same impossible symbols. In the center of the room was a pit. It was vast, stretching endlessly into the darkness below, and from it came a sound, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through my bones. Surrounding the pit were figures, dozens of them. The cult. Their faces were hidden beneath hooded robes, their hands clasped in prayer. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, but I could feel their attention, their focus. They were waiting for me. The whispers in my head reached a fever pitch, demanding, pleading. "Open the book! Release it! Complete the work!" I stepped toward the pit, my body trembling, and opened the book to its final page. The symbols there began to shift and writhe, spilling off the paper and into the air like smoke. The pit began to pulse, its edges glowing with the same faint light as the symbols. And then, something rose from the darkness. At first, it was just a shape, a massive hulking shadow, its edges jagged and unfinished. But as it ascended, it began to take form. A face emerged, impossibly large and grotesque, its features distorted as though seen through a warped glass. Its eyes were hollow voids, pulling in the light around them, and its mouth was a gaping chasm filled with rows of jagged, uneven teeth. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could comprehend. It was the Watcher. The cult began to chant, their voices rising in unison, filling the cavern with a sound that made my skin crawl. The Watcher's eyes turned toward me. I fell to my knees, the book slipping from my hands. "You brought me here," the voice said, not in words, but in thoughts, in feelings that scraped against my mind. "You are mine now." I wanted to run, but my body wouldn't move. The Watcher reached out, its limbs stretching impossibly long, and I felt its touch before it even made contact. A cold, suffocating pressure that wrapped around my soul. I screamed as the world around me dissolved. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the hospital. I was standing in the middle of a city street, surrounded by people who moved past me without a second glance. But something was wrong. The shadows were deeper here, stretching unnaturally long. The faces of the people around me were blurred, indistinct, as though they weren't real. And in every reflective surface, windows, puddles, car mirrors, I saw the Watcher, staring back at me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The Watcher's voice filled my head, low and final. "The work is done. You are the bridge now." And then I understood. The cult hadn't been trying to bind the Watcher to the hospital. They'd been trying to release it, and I had done exactly that. Now, it follows me everywhere. Every reflection, every shadow. It's always there, watching, waiting. And I know, deep down, that it won't stop with just me. It's looking for someone else now. Someone to continue the work. Someone like you. Support the stories you love for just $4.99 a month. Your subscription helps the show grow and continue creating the chilling content you crave. As a thank you, you'll unlock 2 exclusive episodes every month and get full access to our entire library of bonus content. Join today and keep the stories alive.